In 1972, the Atlas Center rocket blasted off from our planet. It launched a probe that would cross our solar system into the farthest reaches of the universe. The mission was to find intelligent life similar to ours. It carried a tablet with an image of us humans and how to locate us in the universe. In the present day, a man called Neil Clark is introduced as one of Great Britain's greatest writers of all time by a woman called Catherine. Dogs start appearing in the audience, disturbing Neil while being interviewed, and suddenly, dogs totally flood the whole scene. Neil wakes up hearing his dog Dennis is barking and his neighbor is ringing the doorbell. She tells him to control his dog or she will have it sent to a dog's home, and Neil calls on Dennis to take a walk. He sees his other neighbor Catherine on his way out, and tells her he just dreamt of her giving him an award for his new novel. She asks him if he has finished the book in real life yet, and he replies it's almost finished, but that he's thinking of changing the whole story. She goes into her apartment, and he and Dennis leave. Meanwhile, the probe in space is found by some alien spaceship, and brought to some aliens of the Intergalactic Council of Superior Species, who sees the plate and starts laughing, having found many such plates before. They ask themselves why inferior aliens always show themselves without clothes, and then take a look at a sample of representative images of Earthlings. One of them thinks Earthlings are barbaric and that they should destroy Earth for the moral well-being of the intergalactic community, but another alien says the galactic law stipulates they must carry out a procedure to see if humanity is worthy of becoming members of the Galactic Council. Meanwhile at a school, Neil's friend and colleague called Ray tells him he must find a woman since every man needs one. Somewhere else, Catherine is telling a man called Grant she doesn't want to see him anymore. Her boss tells her she must come up with questions to destroy a famous author, and Catherine protests, saying everyone loves him and that his new book is absolutely amazing, but is ignored. A colleague tells her their boss hates books, and Catherine can't understand why they are presenting a book program that. The producer comes up, saying books are finished, and that it's their personalities that will make the show, not some book review. Later, Neil sees prices having skyrocketed due to inflation and hears someone sniffling. It's Catherine, and he takes a tissue from a package and hands to her, all while trying to cheer her up by joking she'll become suicidal if she sees the new price on marinated herring. She thanks him and leaves. The Galactic Council says they will do the usual test, choosing one random Earthling to show they understand the difference between good and evil by giving them the power all superior beings have, the ability to do absolutely anything. If the Earthling is good, they will make them a galactic member, and if the Earthling is evil, they will eliminate Earth. The random selection process selects Neil, and as a car hits him while cycling, he receives the power. He wishes the driver would frick himself, and his wish comes true. At a cafe, Catherine tells her friend that Grant is clinically insane. Her friend then asks about her neighbor Neil, and Catherine tells her he's very likable. Neil arrives at his job late, and tries to sneak past the head teacher's office, but is caught. His boss says this is the 12th time he's been late this month and says he'd have him replaced if he could, and Neil tries to explain himself, but is ignored. He goes and sees his class, which is in total disarray. Later in the lunchroom, Ray asks out a colleague called Dorothy on a date, who tells him to drop dead. He meets with Neil and asks what he would do if he could wish for anything. He replies he'd wish Dennis regurgitated his notes from chapter 3, and intact. Ray asks if he would make a girl worship him, and Neil answers that would be taking advantage of an innocent girl. Instead, Ray asks if he'd wish for anything that would make his life instantly better, and Neil responds he'd easily have a spaceship destroy 10C. Suddenly, an explosion is heard, and Neil runs to the classroom to find his whole class totally gone. The Galactic Council contacts the alien spaceship that shot the class, saying they can't kill Earthlings before the judicial review is done. The alien responds he must be kidding since they've found 445,349,722 new alien species, but have yet to grant one species into the council. The council responds they have high standards, but that it all depends on the Earthling. Neil comes home and meets Dennis, seeing dog mess on the floor. The news explained 38 students died in what seems to be a terrorist attack. Neil talks to Dennis, saying it couldn't be a spaceship that did it. If it was, he wouldn't have to pick the dog mess up, he'd just have to tell it to clean itself up. Immediately, the impossible happens, and Neil is totally shocked. He runs to the kitchen to take a drink, and suddenly finds his notes from chapter 3 on the floor. Baffled, he knocks his drink out by mistake, and wishes for it to get back into the bottle, but nothing happens, and he's relieved. He tries again, but waves his hand, and then it happens, and he's shocked. The drink is however clean anymore and he wishes the bottle would exchange itself for another. It starts jumping around, and Neil and Dennis start following it, yelling at it to get back. They get to the store, which is closed, and the bottle destroys the window and the alarm starts. He runs, but is caught by the police, and as he wishes Dennis would help him, Dennis attacks the officer. They escape, but are suddenly caught again, and he wishes he'd be home eating dinner with Dennis, and disappears. He's totally baffled to find himself eating dog food, and while brushing his teeth later, he remembers 10C and wishes everyone would be alive again. His wish comes true, but not like he intended. Dead people start waking around everywhere, and looking outside, Neil quickly clarifies his wish that only those in 10C would be alive again. Realizing he must be specific, he wishes all who are alive again should be totally uninjured. He wishes to feel better and get a really good idea, which he gets, and wishes the explosion never happened. He's suddenly back in the lunchroom with Ray, thinking he dreamt it all, and Ray is explaining he'd make Dorothy worship himself if he could. Meanwhile, Catherine is at work, talking to the producer, when suddenly Grant shows up. She goes out, telling him to get out, but as he ignores her, she calls security. Suddenly the producer comes out telling him to go, and Grant starts to threaten him, and leaves, and she tries to explain to the producer how she met such a dork. As Neil returns to his class, he tries for the sake of fun to wish 10C would become a model class who are eager to learn, and to his surprise, he didn't dream at all. He walks in, telling the class to read the whole chapter at page 73, and the children are excited they get to read the whole chapter this time. On his way out later, Neil wishes the headmaster would be nice to him for a change. And the other employees are totally stunned by how the head teacher behaves towards him. Awkwardly in the personnel room later, Neil sees Ray trying to talk to Dorothy, and wishes she'd worship Ray, and she does, and Neil laughs, figuring he can do anything. On his way home, he wishes he'd be the president of the United States. Suddenly, a car stops, and agents protect him from shooters. In the car, they give him reports to look through, and Neil wishes he'd be his old self and at home. That night, Neil wishes he'd be able to see Catherine, and he does. She hears him and starts screaming, and so he wishes the floor would get back and wishes Catherine forget what happened. At school the next day, Neil goes to explain to Ray he can do anything, but Ray doesn't believe it. Neil wishes the skeleton would explain who he was, and the skeleton starts talking, somewhat scaring Ray, who thinks it's a trick. He then tells it to jump out the window, and it does, right into the headmaster's arms. Ray asks him to do something more, and Neil wishes the room be covered in flowers. The head teacher arrives, and is angry at Ray, but not at Neil. Simultaneously, Grant appears saying he's rented an apartment for them both, and Catherine tells him she's not interested and wants him to go, but he throws her his keys anyway. That evening, Catherine is at home talking to her friend, getting drunk, and explaining how weird all people are around her, Grant and her bosses. They start talking about Neil, and as Catherine notes he's very kind, her friend says he's probably gay, but Catherine says he's not, but attractive. Her friend then suggests she goes up and screws him. Suddenly, the aliens notice there is a galactic power failure and the Earthling won't have his powers until it's fixed. Neil wakes up, having an idea, and wishes Catherine would be madly in love with him, and immediately it knocks on the door. Catherine asks if he's gay, and he responds he's not, and she kisses him, which Grant sees. The next morning, the aliens get the power working again, and Neil wakes up seeing Catherine has left a note. He gets up, wishing the clothes to dress themselves on him, which they do. At school, Ray sees Dorothy has got followers, all worshipping him as a god. At home, Neil is eating and reading a German book. Dennis starts barking, and wondering what Dennis is barking for, he suddenly gets an idea and wishes Dennis could talk. Dennis says he has such a craving for biscuits and can't think of anything else before he gets one, and so Neil goes to fetch some. The two start having a conversation, and suddenly the doorbell rings and Dennis gets excited. Neil asks him to be quiet for just a few moments, telling him he's a good boy. It's Catherine at the door, and as they begin talking, Dennis yells to Neil to shag her. Neil quickly tries to explain it's a plumber named Dennis, and Catherine is confused. He goes to tell Dennis to shut up, and quickly goes back. And Dennis yells he loves him, asking if he can shag his leg. Catherine exclaims her friend was right and rhetorically asks why she always ends up with creeps. Neil wishes Dennis goes back to being a dumb animal for 5 minutes and rushes after Catherine. He's stopped by Grant, and wishes to be on the bus, but quickly wishes to be in the bus instead. Catherine steps off, and Neil runs after, but is now stopped by Ray. Ray is desperate, wanting him to make Dorothy not worship him anymore. Neil says he hasn't time right now, and turns him into a duck, and then a sausage, to get to Catherine, and suddenly Ray's worshippers appear. He goes to Catherine, who doesn't want to have anything to do with him. When he follows her out, the cashier thinks he stole one of their sausages. They begin to argue whose sausage it is, and Neil ends up having to pay for it, after which he turns Ray back to a human. At the Galactic Council, they note Neil has no concept at all of doing any good whatsoever. Catherine comes home, only to see Grant having broken into her place. Scared, she locks the door again, screaming at him to get out of her place the way he got in. Grant is angry and yells back at her that she's not nice to him. Neil suggests she can trick Grant. She leaves, but then sneak up to his place to hide till Grant leaves. She accepts, and Neil runs up to his apartment, all while Grant continues yelling and behaves like a jerk. Neil tells Dennis Catherine will come and asks him to pretend to be a dumb animal while she's there. Dennis asks if he should act like when he acts he likes his tummy tickled. Neil asks what he means, since dogs love to be tickled. Dennis then says it's not true, dogs only pretend because humans love to tickle dogs' tummies, and Neil is stunned. Suddenly the bell rings, and Catherine comes in. She starts tickling Dennis' tummy and asks rhetorically why dogs love that so much. Later, she explains the producer at her work is trying to get her into bed by offering her a big desk with a view. Neil comes out with a soup, and Catherine says it's the most wonderful thing she's ever tasted in her entire life. She asks how he did it, and Neil starts trying to explain he has powers that allow him to do anything, like making his dog Dennis talk. He says, if she wants a bigger desk with a fantastic view, she got it. She doesn't believe him, and suddenly, Dennis tries to warn him Grant is at the window. Suddenly he jumps through the window, and starts insulting Neil, picking up a gun. Neil then starts threatening him, and wishes bullets will bounce off of him, and then wishes Grant would drop the gun. Catherine takes it, throws it out, and leaves. The two fight, and Neil wishes Grant would break his arm, and as Grant starts screaming from the pain, Neil wishes his arm would be good again. Suddenly, Grant realizes Neil has special powers. Neil starts playing around with Grant, telling him he should be nice to him since he can make his life an absolute dream, giving him $1 million, or absolute hell, explaining he just has to wave his hand. Suddenly, Dennis starts talking to Neil, and Grant takes the opportunity to take him out. At work, the producer tells Catherine he got her a new desk. She goes to look, and is absolutely amazed and baffled, realizing Neil actually has powers. Grant has tied Neil to a chair, telling him he must read wishes on a list he has prepared, and if he starts saying one word wrong, he will shoot Dennis. Neil has no choice but to start reading Grant's weird wishes. Catherine runs home to Neil, discovering something has happened to him, but hears a sound. She goes to look, and it's Ray, who's also trying to find Neil, explaining to Catherine that Dorothy wants to prove he is immortal by rising from the dead. She thinks she knows where they are, and grabs Grant's keys. Outside, Dorothy and her religious group start chasing them. Grant is getting his wishes granted, and next up, he wishes all police to wear pink uniforms, which Neil thinks is totally ridiculous. That evening, Catherine and Ray get to Grant's place. Grant wishes all traffic lights be permanently green, and they see cars crashing on the streets. Suddenly Catherine knocks and calls Grant's name. Grant tells Neil to skip to the end, just as they break in. To save Dennis, Neil reads the wish, making Catherine madly in love with Grant such that she wants to screw him. Neil then frees himself and Dennis, turns Grant into a corgi, and undoes all Grant's wishes. Suddenly Dorothy appears, and Neil makes her and everybody else stop worshipping Ray. As Ray and Catherine leave upset, the aliens conclude Neil has no concept of good or evil. The next day, Neil confronts Catherine outside their apartments, but she doesn't want to see him since she can't trust someone who can wish for anything he wants. Neil talks with Dennis at dinner, remarking everybody hates him, but Dennis replies he doesn't hate him, saying he loves him as his master. Neil clarifies he only used his powers for selfish reasons, not for other people's sake. He then wishes everybody had as much food as they want, which should solve world hunger. Neil then starts wishing everybody lived in their dream house, that there would be no reason for anyone to make war on anyone anymore, and reverse global warming. Dennis asks if it happened, and they take a look at the news. Apparently, everything is going wrong. The abundance of food has caused the average weight in some countries to be over 300 pounds. The entire Earth's surface has been turned into real estate development grounds, and countries all over the world are declaring war on each other for no reason at all. Suddenly it starts getting really cold, and on the TV they say the entire world is freezing and that Earth is on the verge of entering an ice age. Shocked, Neil undoes all his wishes, and suddenly, the TV reports how beautiful a world we live in. Neil remarks absolute power doesn't corrupt, but drives you bloody mad. He goes to jump off a bridge, and Dennis yells not to do it because he loves him. Neil explains to Dennis he can't stand the responsibility, saying he's fixed so he'll have enough dog biscuits for a lifetime, and Dennis thanks his master, after which he jumps. But Dennis jumps after to save Neil, but Neil is fine, and they both swim to the shore. The aliens remark the time is up and will check if Neil passed the test. They comment Neil started all those wars, which they think was good, but that he then stopped them all to make it better for people, which they think is very appalling. The council concludes his care to make things better is a weakness, and so rules that the Earthling and his wretched planet must be vaporized, initiating a destruction generator. Meanwhile on Earth, Neil is talking to Dennis, and Dennis suggests he can give his powers to him. That way he wouldn't have them. Dennis adds that, since he's a dog, all he wants to do is follow orders from his master, and will do what he tells him to do. Neil thinks it's genius. Having transferred his powers, Neil asks what Dennis will wish for. Dennis remarks, thinking out loud, that the powers made his master miserable, and Neil asks what he's thinking about, but gets no answer. Dennis then suddenly asks for forgiveness, and Neil gets scared. The aliens shoot their destructive ray towards Earth, and simultaneously, to make no one miserable like his master again, Dennis wishes that the source of his power be destroyed forever. In the nick of time, Earth is saved, and the aliens get desperate hearing the dog's wish, yelling the dog is evil, which becomes their very last words. The destructive ray then travels from planet to planet, across the universe, eliminating the entire galactic council of superior beings. Suddenly Neil awakens to Dennis barking to the doorbell, and tests if he has his powers, which he hasn't. He opens up and kisses his angry neighbor, who is stunned. Hearing Catherine, he runs down, telling her he got rid of his powers, and asks her out for dinner. She says maybe and closes the door on him, but suddenly opens again, asking if he's free tonight. In the hallway, Grant as a corgi asks Dennis to turn him back, saying he's a man, not a dog, and Dennis replies, "No one is perfect." The end.